Three, two, one. We are live. Hello and welcome to Proptech Buzz, a podcast channel where we talk to Proptech leaders, founders, CEOs, investors from all around the world and learn from them how they build and scale successful Proptech companies. Today, I'm joined with me with Troy Davis, who is a seasoned entrepreneur and technology enthusiast with a passion for revolutionizing the real estate industry. He has a background in software development and team management. Troy has carved a niche for himself in the private sector. His journey began in advertising and marketing before steering him into the startup community. Founded a development company of his own, and then launched him in a series of CTO roles, including Proptech startups. Troy has a keen interest in leveraging technology to streamline processes and enhances user experience in the real estate domain. And his career trajectory reflects his commitment to innovation, having led various initiatives focused on integrating cutting-edge tech solutions into traditional real estate practices. With that, let's welcome Troy. Troy, welcome to Proptech Buzz. How are you doing today?
Thank you so much, Ravi. It's great to be here. Thank you for having me on the podcast.
We have been trying to have you, and finally you are here. Very excited for this conversation, Troy. So the theme of this podcast is using open standards to avoid PropTech app development pitfalls, and my questions would be around that, Troy. But let me begin with asking, how do open standards mitigate pitfalls in PropTech app development?
Well, that's multifold. I think one of them is that open standards tend to be documented better than proprietary standards. There tends to be more people that have worked with those open standards. There's more existing work out there, more examples that you can see of how other people solved problems, and that's pretty consistent across all industries. That's not just in prop tech, of course, but anytime you're working with open source software, there tends to be just more usage of that software than there is for proprietary alternatives. There's niche products everywhere, including in open source, and those don't have a lot of users either, but we're talking about major products that help solve problems, But I think the other thing is just in compatibility and reducing the amount of duplicative work that you have to do when you create a PropTech app. So if the partners you're working with are utilizing open standards and you're utilizing those too, you should be able to reuse that code with the next person that also uses the same open standards. And that's a tremendous amount of work that's saved, instead of having to, every time you adapt to a new system that you want to integrate with, you have to write completely new software just to talk to that one system. That's not very scalable. It's not very easy to make a large impact in the industry that way. So the work that, for instance, Rezo has done in establishing a lot of open standards around real estate data and transport methods, we have benefited greatly from that, and definitely standing on the shoulders of a lot of giants there.
So are we talking about, when we talk about open standards, what are some of the examples? Is resource standards would be one of the examples. Are there other open standards in the industry?
Well, there's some that can be used in our industry too. In the United States, the U.S. Postal Code Service has a very specific address format standard. That's not necessarily one that you would work with a ton, but it's useful. I think a lot of the data a lot of the open standards that I am talking about has to do with Rezo standards, which are real estate specific. The data dictionary is one of them in particular. The 2.0 data dictionary version was ratified not too long ago, and it's being adopted by the industry over time. A lot of folks already have 1.7. The data dictionary 1.7 is already implemented as a standard. And those are basically mirrors of their proprietary data in most cases. So a lot of the systems, they have data in a proprietary format with the vendor that they work with. They'll set up a Rezo Web API instance that will take that data, normalize it into Rezo's data dictionary format, and then provide that via API. So that's the way that you'll get that data in a standardized format. But there's some older standards too that are not quite as helpful. Like RETS, for instance, is common in the industry and it's useful. it's kind of light on standardization because pretty much everybody can implement RETs a different way. But there is, a structure to it that you can build on top of that. At least you don't have to repeat that structure, even if the data itself is quite a bit different. And then I'll mention the other thing, so the data dictionary is one, transport standards are another, things like RETs, the Reso Web API, those are transport standards. The add-edit API portion of the Reso API is a big deal there as well, giving it, write compatibility as well as read. And I think the other big one is really their business rule set. So there's been a couple different languages that are used for business rules in the industry throughout the past. The biggest ones I can think of are RETs validation expressions and Reber. But there are proprietary business languages or business rule languages throughout the industry as well, JIPs and a few others. But Reso did promote and develop its own specific real estate optimized business rules language that's called Reso validation expressions. And that particular language is really quite capable. It's if you're familiar with it, it's a Turing complete programming language, which means you could theoretically write any program in that language to solve any computing problem. At a practical level, you probably wouldn't do that. You'd probably just use it for business rules. But what that really means, though, is that the business rules can take on a lot of complexity to them, and a lot of computational logic can be embedded in those rules, which is a big improvement over what RETs validation expressions and Reber offered in the past.
Got it. I had Sam Debord on my podcast, and I had a similar question to him. So do you think Reso has had a big impact in the industry with its a push towards open source?
Massive, and it's hard to say open source. They're not trying to get everybody to open source their proprietary concepts. I mean, OCUSELL, we use open standards a lot. We don't open source most of our software either. That's pretty normal in the industry. We have contributed some source back. We contributed the add-edit API demo software as part of the Reso reference implementation server. So we did contribute that back to the open source community. But it's really about defining a standard so that everybody knows how to communicate and how to exchange data efficiently. Those standards in particular seem really helpful right now, and they don't, offer any form of, blocker to intellectual property rights or anything like that.
Got it. So Troy, I read through your past career trajectory, and you were not always in Proptech, right? So could you share that pivotal moment that led you to focus on Proptech solutions?
Sure. So I started out. I just started programming when I was like 10. I was writing video games and simple things like that. But just beating up on computers in my math classroom and at home. Commodore 64, writing BASIC and that sort of thing. But by the time I was in college, I was working on early websites, which I'm going to reveal my age here a little bit. But the web was very new when I was in college, and it was a very new thing at the time. But I was very excited about it, and I started building some websites, and I had access to a Nextcube. And Nextcubes were what Sir Tim Berners-Lee developed the first web browser and web server on, which was really cool. And it had that software in it, and I was able to play with the original web server and web browser software. It was very neat. That led me into marketing and advertising right upon graduation from college. So I was hired before I graduated from college to work at an ad agency here in Cincinnati. And worked there for many years and really liked it a lot. Learned a ton about business and all sorts of different business models, and worked with some real estate oriented companies back then too, some home developers and a few others. It was pretty cool, and learned a little bit about real estate back then, but I had a very diverse set of projects that we did. So I guess, one of the advertising agencies that I worked for toward the end of my advertising stint of my career, they developed a product that was a WYSIWYG editor for website content, sort of like a WordPress kind of thing. And I don't know, over the course of about 2 years, we suddenly had like 50 or 75 clients using it and paying us a pretty decent monthly fee for it. We're like, man, we really have something here. And my the CEO of the company, my boss, he ran into an angel investor at a meeting, and the angel investor got very interested and started having meetings with us. And before I knew it, I was in the startup world, which I had no idea about. That was new to me. It was very interesting, and but that was 2008. So 2008 until 2009, we spent about $500,000 developing out the software for that startup, and we were supposed to get another $500,000 in 2009 in order to do the marketing push for it and publicize the software and market it. And that's when our economy collapsed, of course. And our investor got cold feet, pulled his investment out, and the company went bankrupt, and we were out of business. And I was very depressed, and I felt like, I had lost a relative or somebody I cared about very dearly, and felt like I had failed in a very big way. The reality was it was a very complex situation, and one person doesn't usually make the difference between whether a startup succeeds or fails. It's usually a lot bigger of an equation than that. But I was definitely blaming myself, I think, at that point. But then I started getting calls, and I thought this was like a career-ending kind of thing. You start a startup and it fails, and nobody's going to want to talk to you again. But the funny thing that happened was there was a whole bunch of people that started contacting me and say, "Hey, would you help us with our startup? We've got this. We need to build a development team. We need to get our MVP done." And I was kind of surprised by that, but it led into about the next 10 years of my career. I was just a CTO for startup companies in kind of a serial fashion. And I would get hired by a startup company. I would help them do a little bit of provisional work and verify their concept, and then they'd start hiring a team, and I would help them hire a team and build the team up and train them and get them producing really good software. By the time the software was working pretty well and the investors were happy and things were going along okay, I would start getting kind of itchy and start looking for the door. And so I just did that for about 10 years. I probably worked with 6-7 startups during that time. And, a couple of them succeeded, which was great. Neither one of those I had any ownership interest in, unfortunately, but they did very well. I was very happy for them. And then I decided that, usually when I walked away from a startup and went to do something else, I noticed that within 6 months or so, the team that I had constructed so carefully just blew up. So I was kind of annoyed with that, and decided eventually I wanted to start my own team. So back in 2014, early 2015, I started a company called Lampros Labs. So that would be my development team that I wanted to build. And I've been running that business ever since. About 6 years ago, I met Hayden Reefschel, the CEO for OCUSELL, and he was very early on at that point. And we didn't actually start working together for another 2 years after that. So about 4 years ago, I started working on OCUSELL. I had done a couple of other real estate projects prior to this. There was one that was in the rental space and one that had to do with managing contact information for realtors and brokers and that sort of thing. So I was familiar with the Proptech space already to some degree, but I had never tried before I worked with OCUSELL to do the level of detail interaction that we do with MLSs. I had done some work with MLSs, and that's kind of what helped me start working with OCUSELL. But the level of complexity that we've gotten into in working with MLSs is way beyond anything that I thought we would be doing, quite honestly. Much more complex than I would have thought it would have been.
Got it. So when you were working as a serial CTO, was it a fractional CTO kind of a role, or you were always a full-time and work for a couple of years and then move?
It started off that it was mostly full-time gigs. But by the time I was getting toward the end of that phase, I was serving as CTO's fractional capacity for multiple organizations. And I mean, to this day, if I've got a project that I'm working on with somebody and they need somebody to go to an investor meeting with them, I'm happy to take on that CTO role with them and help them present to their investors and help them understand their business concept and the technology behind it that we've built and that sort of thing. So,
got it.
So I guess it was full-time at start and became fractional over time. Yeah, but that was fine. It wasn't like most of the companies didn't have the funding to hire me full-time anyway. So fractional was pretty natural fit.
Got it. Usually it is just to showcase the strength of the team in front of the investors, right? Because if you're building a tech company and you do not have a strong CTO, it's always hard to make a good impression in front of the investors. And then if you do not have the funds, how can you afford a full-time CTO? So it's just like, I think Yeah, it's a chicken and egg situation.
Yeah. So
Good.
being the co-founder CTO role is, it's a tough one. I think a lot of startups want a co-founder CTO, but the reality is there's not as many CTOs as there are startup founders. So there's a number inequity problem there, that there's not enough CTOs to go around. Something that I would very much like to work on. I think that's something that's been a long-term problem in our industry in general, and not just Proptech, but also just software development in general. There's not nearly as many CTOs as there are job openings for CTOs. So, and that's something that I'm happy to be starting a new project with the U.S. Proptech Council. We'll be doing a CTO with the intention of mentoring and providing a place for CTOs to seek information and get advice and share experiences and case studies and that sort of thing with each other, and hopefully grow a bigger community. And maybe we'll actually convince some folks that don't see themselves as CTOs to try it out. I mean, you do have to have a really strong technical background in order to do it. And you also have to have more extroversion than most software developers usually have.
Right.
But it's doable. I'm not an extrovert by nature. I'm definitely an introvert, but I'm one of those people that I can be extroverted when I want to. I just realized that it costs me energy. True extroverts, they get energized by that social interaction. For me, I get tired after doing it for a while, and I have to rest. But,
so what is it? So now that we have dwelled into this topic, maybe shed some light on what does it take to be a good CTO other than the technology skills?
Well, I'm going to double down on the technology skills, because I've met enough CTOs at this point that didn't have a tech background, and they don't help their companies very much. And that's kind of a big problem. So I feel like the best CTOs I've ever met came up through technical development first. So their career would have been as developers, team leads, that they would have taken on some kind of direction level within their development team. And then they also were interested in business as a general topic and started educating themselves on that, or got some education if they wanted to go back to school or something like that. So you start off with a really strong technical foundation, so you actually understand what is possible, what is not, and you know how to talk to developers to understand what they're telling you, right? So that you're not disillusioned about, well, I told them that I wanted this, and they said, okay, well, that doesn't mean it's going to happen, especially if it's not actually feasible and they just don't know how to tell you no. So it's really important that you understand technical feasibility at an inherent level. The business knowledge has to come with it, though. You have to understand how different business models work. You have to understand how corporate governance works. You have to understand, if you're going to be working with startups, you have to understand how investors work with startups and what your relationship is to those investors, and how important it is for you to be truthful with everybody about what you're doing. I think I've seen a lot of people, miss opportunities in business because they weren't fully transparent either with their investors or with the other executives in their company about what their technology could or couldn't do. And that's very dangerous. That's one of the reasons why, again, doubling up on technical literacy, you have to understand what's feasible and what's not, or otherwise you're going to misadvise people, right? So, and I guess the other thing is enjoying working with people who like working with technology. It's one thing to enjoy working with people. There's all sorts of people who like working with people, but not everybody likes working with people who like working with technology. There are different kind of people.
Could you explain that? Why is that?
So working with developers is not really like working with a lot of other kinds of employees. It's more like working with artists and scientists, right? It's not like just working with, somebody else at a bank, or somebody else at a restaurant. These folks are in their heads a lot. They spend a lot of time thinking about the kinds of things that they do and the code that they write and the interfaces they design and how it's usable. And they're a very logical group of people most of the time. And I think that's something that's difficult to relate to for a lot of business people, that they don't have
Hmm.
that really strong logical foundation underlying how they interact with people. So, the extent to which you need to be a logical person when you work with technicians is very high. You've got to be, my personal opinion, radical candor is a great model to work with
Hmm.
technicians under, because they expect you to tell them the truth. And if they find out that you're not telling them the truth about something, they won't trust you anymore. And
Hmm.
you've ruined that relationship and the work that you could have gotten done with that person.
So
Um,
what is the best way for a CTO to win the respect of the developers in the company, and just build a good rapport with them? What does it take for a CTO?
I think you have to, for one thing, you have to really know the technology that you're building so that you can intelligently communicate with the developers about what to do. You have to have a vision in your mind for what you're building, because the developers are going to become very focused on their part of the work, and they're not going to have
Hmm.
the big vision in mind of what the ultimate goal is. You can't do it at the
Hmm.
same time. You've been asked to develop this one feature in one part of a product on one screen. You might work on that for weeks. You're going to focus entirely on just that little functionality, right? That little bit of
Hmm.
functionality. But so it's easy for someone to become blindered, where you wind up with kind of the blinders on and you can't see what's happening on the sides of you. And it's, in my opinion, it's the role of the CTO to help remind the developers of what the big vision is for the product and where this fits
Hmm.
in the overall product, because they make a lot of decisions that
Hmm.
are, based on a lot of assumptions. And if the assumptions are off, you just built something that becomes technical debt instead of a technical asset,
Got it.
you know?
Got it.
So I
Excellent.
think if you want to win the trust of developers, I think the other thing too is that when you know that the developer is right and the other team members are, what they're asking for doesn't make sense, you have to stand up for the developers and tell the other business people why the developers are telling them the truth, and
Hmm.
you have to be fair about it. You don't defend bad positions just because they're a developer, right?
Hmm.
But if if they've got a valid argument behind what they're telling the other business people that they're trying to work with,
Hmm.
and the business people are pushing back, if you're a good CTO, you know what is doable and what is not, and you will tell everyone how that works. And in that regard, you are basically defending the developer from unrealistic expectations.
Hmm.
You know,
And is it fair to imagine that developers, they are so much in love with coding code? They say writing code is like writing poetry, and the good developers just love coding. So are they also, is it a myth, or is it there is some truth to it when it is said that developers are not social? They don't like to be pulled into meetings. They just love
uh,
love to code. Is that true?
you know, I mean, other than, I don't know anybody who likes being pulled into a lot of meetings. I don't think that that's unique to developers.
Okay,
Um,
got it.
yeah, but I will say that there's something to that though. I think
Hmm.
there's some validity to what you're saying. No,
Hmm.
developers don't like to spend a lot of time in meetings, because usually when you're meeting with a developer, you're telling them that you want them to write some specific software. But if you keep
Hmm.
getting into meetings, they don't have time to write that software,
Hmm.
right? So you can't run a technical development operation without meetings. That's not possible. But
Hmm.
you have to try to minimize the amount of time that you spend in meetings, and defending the productivity of that time during the meeting is also, in my opinion, the role of a CTO, as well as any project manager that's working on the project. You don't want any
Hmm.
team members to start feeling like this meeting that we have every week is a waste of time.
Got it. There has to be
You
value.
know?
Yeah.
And if it is a waste of time, cancel the meeting, right?
Hmm.
If you're not producing anything as a result of that meeting, get rid of it. There's no point in it if it's not creating more software or better software or higher quality software, right? So why meet if it's not producing something? And I think that's really, developers will tolerate meetings so long as they are, uh, you know, helpful in the production of the software.
Got it.
But
Got
you
it.
get beyond that, and they're not happy anymore, and I can't blame them. Nobody would be happy with that.
True. I get that. Great. We took a little detour there, but that was worth understanding a little deeply, because CTOs lead the product development team. It's important to know the dynamics there. But let's come back to the open data standards. So, what role do open standards play in enhancing user experiences within the real estate domain?
I think it's almost a secondary effect. Software is more usable and more meaningful and more intuitive to people if the developers didn't have to fight so hard to make it. It's easier for a developer to focus on making something user-friendly if they didn't have to do an uphill struggle the whole time just to get the software to function. So by using and relying on open standards, you collapse the amount of difficulties and the number of problems that you're going to have getting that core functionality to work. And when you do that, you still have time left in the schedule to make it highly usable. So if you want to make usable software, using open standards as the basis for your work is a pretty good bet, because it just means that you spend less time reinventing the wheel, right? And you can spend more time focusing in on what makes your app great, what makes it novel, what makes it intuitive and useful to people. You can focus on those aspects of usability rather than just getting the functionality to work at a core level, right? So I think it's really just about, time use. If I have to divide my time equally between interpreting complex proprietary software and trying to make something usable, then that's less time spent on usability than if I had open standards that are easy to adapt to and easy to integrate with.
Could you elaborate this? Could you elaborate this with a specific example or a specific project where leveraging open standard significantly accelerated development and improved the experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, OCUSELL's main product is a AI listing manager, right? So this helps brokers and agents create listings that can be published to multiple MLSs in one step. So the listing manager basically merges together all of the fields that you would fill out for a property in an MLS and does it in an intelligent way. It's all algorithmic. We don't do any of that manually. It'd be crazy to try to do that. But the first version of the app that we wrote, we actually had all of the publishing code in the app. So when it went out to one MLS that was on Rapatoni, it would use the proprietary Rapatoni API in order to do that publish job. And when it was sending something to Spark API, FBS's Matrix product, not Matrix, FBS. What is FBS's Spark API is Flex MLS. So Flex MLS, they had an API at one time. They don't have one right now, but they had an API at one time. We wrote software for it. And again, another proprietary piece of software. So every time we wanted to publish something to multiple MLSs, we had all of this code in our app that had to do with publishing rules. And that app became messy in the sense that we had to write so much code for publishing that it was distracting from usability and UI and user experience, right? So we made a tactical choice, and we rewrote the app a couple of years ago, about 2 years ago. We rewrote the app so that we separated the publishing functionality into a separate server. And what that server does is it uses the Rezo add edit API as the way that our app communicates with it. Now that's very easy. It's an open standard. There's just one way to talk to it. And we can wrap up all of the data structures of all of the MLSs in a Rezo compliant wrapper. And we can interact with it that way from our app. So our app knows about all of the specifics and differences between MLSs, but all of the data is represented in a standardized container that's all Rezo defined, right? So our app got simpler. Our publishing app took on the responsibility of figuring out how to publish into all of these different proprietary systems, and some of them are RET systems. So, right now, that publishing server we call Meridian, it's now its own product. And something that other app developers, if you want to talk to a bunch of different MLSs and publish data into them, it'd make your job a lot easier to use something like Meridian than to write all that code yourself like we did the first time. But because you can externalize the complexities of the publishing process in this case, then you can return time and the budget to focusing on usability in the app. And that's ultimately why the OCUSELL, AI listing manager is so usable and intuitive, because we spent a ton of time trying to make it so, and we didn't have to muck around with a lot of code that was specific to every MLS's publishing process to do it. That got externalized. A different group of people worked on the publishing problems. The people working on the app that the brokers use, they were able to focus on the usability of that much more so.
Got it. What advice would you offer to startups who are looking to integrate cutting-edge technology into traditional real estate practices?
Good question. I think one thing is establish good relationships with the people that you're integrating with. If you don't have a good relationship with the people that you're going to try to do an integration with, you're going to get stuck at some point with a problem and you won't be able to resolve it. So, this is, I always think it's kind of interesting that ultimately, if you want to conquer great technical problems, you really have to start with people. Being a developer is not just about talking to machines. We spend more time talking with people than we do with machines. We may spend a lot of time writing code, but ultimately we have to talk to people about that code much more than the time we spend with our computers writing it. So if you're going to build an app in the Proptech space and you want to minimize your effort, build good relationships with the people that you want to integrate with. And if you can't build the relationship with those people, maybe you ought to think about a different partner. Find somebody else who can take that role, right? There's plenty of, unfriendly, people out there that just don't want to work with you. And that's fine. They have every right to make that decision that they don't want to work with you. Find somebody who does want to work with you,
Got it.
Because once you have that relationship built with that, that partner, then when you do run into a problem, you know who to call. You've already got a rapport with that person. They already know who you are. You're not going to have to go through a whole, 3 phases of, 3 tiers of tech support to get to somebody that can help you, right? You can call the person that you need to talk to right away because you've built a personal relationship with them. So I think that's one thing. So build the personal relationships. I think the second thing is be laser focused on what it is that you're building and the value that it provides. There's a lot of people that spend a lot of time developing parts of their apps that really do not differentiate them. And I don't know what that does for you. You have to spend your time on what differentiates you, not on what is common between you and other solutions, right? And then, the last thing I'll say, I'll take it back to the open standards kind of thing. Use as many open standards as you can in order to build your product up. I mean, use them intelligently. Don't just adopt them just because there is one. But if there's an open standard that exists that you can use instead of redefining that and it works for you, you should use the open standard, right? Just a much better path. Easier to communicate with everybody else on the team, easier to get it developed and working, easier to debug, easier to document, easier to support later and maintain. It's just, there's a tremendous amount of time savings that come from using open standards when you build apps. And we're very focused in our industry. I mean, for good reason. We're very focused on developing something novel that we can get a patent, right? That's a really important thing in the software development space. And I've helped plenty of the clients that I've worked with get patents on the stuff that we developed for them. And I don't want to take away from the importance of that. That is extremely important to build something that's novel, that is a novel invention that you really can get intellectual property rights on and have some form of protection. But that doesn't mean that everything in your app has to redefine how we do computing and programming. You know what I mean? That's just a bit too far. And you're taking on too much work that you don't need to.
That's it, right? Anything else there?
I don't know. I guess talk to a lot of people in your industry and get to know the personalities and get to know the reputations of the people that you're dealing with. Because, it's possible for somebody to put on, quite a face for you in order to get the relationship started because they want something from you. But as soon as they've got what they want, they're not going to be helping you anymore. If you know that's a very transactional kind of person, then
Right.
maybe you can look for another partner, right? I mean, you're not going to find that out unless you build connections with people in that business community and get to know those folks. And then you can say, hey, what's it like to work with this person? Have you worked with them before? And, if they say, oh, wonderful, I love working with that person. They do such a great job and they're so helpful, and responsive. And you'll ask about somebody else that, impressed you just as much in a meeting just the other day. And you ask them about that. Oh my God, don't ever work with that person. I had the most awful experience, after we did something together that we all agreed on, then they sued us. And it was just crazy, So you'll get really eye-opening kinds of reports from other people in the industry. And most industries are kind of self-policing that way, right? I mean, they're not terrible at that as far as maintaining an understanding of the reputations of the people in that industry.
Right.
So talking to those folks and getting to understand, talking to other people in the industry and understanding who this is that you're about to partner with, understand what their reputation is and their past track record. You may decide to take a risk on someone anyway, but at least you're making an informed decision then.
Got it. Excellent. You're a passionate adopter of open standards and you have been at the cutting edge. How do you see open standards shaping the future of PropTech innovation?
Well, it's interesting because I think in some ways, once Rezo had defined the data dictionary, the transport standards, Rezo Web API, the add-edit implementation, and now their business rules, most of what they needed to define is now defined. And they'll refine it and they'll continue to improve it over time. But in a lot of ways, what the industry needs is kind of there, at least as a base structure. And we'll continue to modify it and adapt it to, future uses that we haven't thought of yet. That'll happen too. But I think the future of open standards is really at this point in the PropTech industry is just about adoption. We have good standards, right? The adoption curve is what's slow. I was making a joke about, I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. Mark Twain, famous writer, made a joke about Cincinnati in his day in the 1800s and said he wanted to be in Cincinnati if the end times ever came because everything happens here 20 years later. I think that the real estate industry, the PropTech sector in particular, is a lot like that. Everything that happened in the other industry 20 years ago is just now happening in the PropTech industry. And, the adoption of open standards is definitely one of those trends. Most other industries have already been affected by the open standards wave, and they've already gone through an adoption cycle. We're in the midst of what I would consider kind of the opening wave of a mass adoption cycle of open standards within the PropTech industry. And it'll be another 5 to 10 years before that's really complete.
Got it. Excellent. Great. Thank you. My last question here is, as a tech leader, how do you stay updated on emerging open standards and ensure that your company, OCUSELL, remains at the forefront of PropTech innovation?
Well, we decided to get involved with Rezo, not just attend their conferences or, read the stuff they publish online, but we do go to their conferences, but we also wanted to get involved. So we volunteered to do, speaking at the events. We have topics we can speak on that are, we have knowledge in areas that a lot of other people don't. So we can share that knowledge with people at the conferences. We also did a little bit of volunteering with Rezo just to help out on a couple projects and, some things that they needed to get done. So we lent a little bit of help there. And that basically created a good relationship between us and the people that work inside of Rezo. And the other people that volunteer, because Rezo is a nonprofit, a lot of people are volunteering their time there. There's very few people that are actually paid, right? I participate in some of the work groups, right? They have these work work groups that are focused around separate topics, specific topics. We assign some of our staff members to different work groups to attend those and to report back to the company and tell us what's going on so we can stay abreast of what they're up to in different areas. That visibility level, and I think that was actually the folks from CMLS, I think, told me about that about 2 years ago, was that process of, becoming members of the work groups, participating in the events, helping out with the events, getting to know the people that are behind the organization. I think all of those things feed into, you get to know about things as they're being talked about initially rather than after they've been decided upon. And it also gives you a chance to interject. I know one of the things that, we saw recently was we realized that the rules language that Rezo has developed could be extended a little bit in order to provide a new functionality that we want, which is, business rules sometimes depend upon third-party services that you can't get their data. It's not licensable to you. It's too much data to pull into your own system, et cetera. So a lot of cases where a business rule relies on a big data set behind it to make a decision, and you don't want to pull all of that into your system just to be able to run that business rule. So we're recommending back to Rezo, we're going to kind of do a more formal proposal of it, but extend off of the existing Rezo rule spec in order to encode a rule that basically is a API call, right? And you kind of define, here's the API, the endpoint that you call, how do you, what kind of credentials do you need? How do you access those? Where's the secret manager? And then also what kind of data should you expect back as a true or a false? And make that a business so that when it gets to that point in the rule execution flow, it knows to go check this API, send it this particular data, get this return back, and that helps you make the decision of whether the rule passed or failed. Right?
Got it.
So the fact that we've been participating in a lot of the meetings of Rezo, we kind of saw the tail end of the adoption cycle for that business rules language. And it definitely gave us some ideas. And, we've now come back with some ideas that we want to contribute back to the group as well. So I think, I think that's a big part of it. When you use the open standards in your own products, you realize the things that are missing that you need. And those become great feedback to take back to the organization.
Excellent. Well, this brings us to the end of a very fascinating conversation with Troy. Troy, thank you for your time and taking your precious time with us and sharing the wealth of knowledge that you have acquired, deserving this so in the last several years, and your experience came through. So thank you for your time, Troy.
Thank you very much, Ravi. I really like what you guys there at Proptech Buzz are doing for the industry. Really appreciate it, and we'll be tuning in and staying tuned to everything you guys do too. It's a good information source. And I'll just mention we're mostly based in the U.S. right now. It's been one of the things that's where we got started, but we're very interested in expanding internationally. It's one of the things we like about Proptech Buzz is that you do have a global market. So I'm looking to learn in the next year. I'm very anxious to learn a lot more about real estate in other nations and how we might be able to help them as well. So hopefully we'll be seeing you guys at some international conferences as well. That'd be fun.
Sure. Thank you so much, Troy. See you around. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.